Hello students, welcome to the 5th video lecture for healthcare ethics. Okay, so we're going to start this week's lecture with a bit of business, and it regards the worksheets. So last week's worksheet, the worksheet for week 13, is super important. So this week, week 14, is the last worksheet. But last week's, week 13, is way more important than this week's. So if you did not complete the worksheet for week 13, please go back and do it. The reason it's important is because it asks you to write a pitch for your op-ed assignment. When I get your pitch, I can read it and give you feedback that will help you write your assignment. So if you have already submitted your worksheet 13 with your op-ed pitch, great, wonderful. And if not, please submit it as soon as possible. So the op-eds are due on May 15th. If I have already received your worksheet, I will return it to you by Tuesday, May 5th. And then you will have 10 days to write the assignment and turn it in on the 15th. If you have not yet submitted your worksheet, please do, and I will return it to you as swiftly as possible. This is the last week of readings and worksheets and lectures. Next week, you guys are watching a movie on your own, which is called No Mas Bebés. The movie is about, for our purposes, is about informed consent and reproductive justice. It addresses many of the questions we are considering in today's lecture, but it places them in a clinical setting rather than a research setting. There is an optional reading for next week, which is up on Blackboard, but it's really, really optional. It's a great essay. I encourage you to read it if you have time. And if you're interested in the topic, but you don't have to read it for the purposes of this course. You will not be tested on it or quizzed upon it. But you do need to watch the film next week. And there is a link to watch the film in the Blackboard folder for week 15. Okay? So that's for next week. For this week, you guys are reading excerpts from this book, Bad Blood by James H. Jones. And you're watching this video lecture and you're going to do a worksheet. Okay, so worksheet for week 14, the last of the worksheets. Hooray. Next week, I'm not going to post a video lecture that goes with the film, No Mas Bebés, but I will be posting a short video lecture with review material for the final exam. And it'll also have some advice for writing your op-eds. The exam will be a take-home, just like the midterm, but you'll have a bit more time to do it. And it takes place on May 22nd, so roughly 3 weeks from now. I'll give you guys a lot more details about it in next week's video. But if you have questions about the exam, about the worksheets, about the content of the lectures, or about your op-ed assignment, please send me an email. Okay, so this week's lecture covers research ethics and the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. I asked you guys to read chapters 1 and 10 from James Jones's 1993 book, Bad Blood. So this book. Chapter 1 is titled A Moral Astigmatism, and it gives a general overview of the study. And chapter 10 is titled The Joy of My Life, and it is about Nurse Rivers. I asked you to read it because she's a particularly interesting figure in relation to the study, and she helps us see some of the bigger ethical quandaries that it generated. So Jones's book was one of the books that I asked you guys to buy in the original course syllabus. So if you have a physical copy, awesome. If you don't, that's okay. there is a link to an online version of the text in the course materials folder on Blackboard for this week. To access this version, you have to make an account at archive.org and then log in and borrow the book from their digital library. I strongly recommend that you do this if you don't have the print book, because it's the only way you're going to get the reading for this week. And you might even want to do it if you do have the print book. Just because archive.org is a really useful website. They have all sorts of books that you can borrow, not just boring course books like this one. And they've created this thing called the National Emergency Library, which is an online borrowing library that has lots of books that you can borrow and read while our brick and mortar libraries are closed during the coronavirus pandemic. Your local branch libraries should have online catalogs too, and ways of borrowing books online, but this is a good resource to know about. Okay, so check out the link to archive.org and make sure you get the reading done one way or another. Okay, so why are we reading this book in this course? The Tuskegee Syphilis experiment is the most dramatic example of long-term systemic failure of medical ethics in the United States in the 20th century. We have focused on clinical ethics thus far. The Tuskegee Study is a failure of research ethics. Yet, just as medical practice and medical research are governed by the same goals of healing the sick, clinical and research ethics are governed by the same ethical principles. I'll talk a bit more about research ethics later in the lecture, but it's worth pointing out here that the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, which is a large research-oriented nonprofit in Washington, lists beneficence and non-maleficence as the first point in their code of ethics. So we can think about the ethical failure that occurred at Tuskegee in terms of the key ethical concepts we have studied in this course. It is a failure of beneficence and of non-maleficence. A failure to respect the autonomy of the patient, and a failure of fairness, which we have been discussing in this course in terms of social justice. Okay, so what happened? The Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, as it was officially known, began in 1932 and became, according to James Jones, quote, the longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. The study ran for 41 years, ending only in 1973 as a result of journalistic expose and public outcry. As Jones notes on the very first page of Chapter 1, the study, quote, involved a substantial number of men, 399 who had syphilis and an additional 201 who were free of the disease, chosen to serve as controls. All of the syphilitic men were in the late stage of the disease when the study began. So Jones gives a good description of the disease itself and how it affects the human body on pages 2 through 4 of our reading. He explains that tertiary stage syphilis, so that is the stage that the men in the study were at when the study began, tertiary stage syphilis often causes particularly disastrous, irreversible cardiovascular and neurological effects. Syphilis ultimately produces death. and it did produce death in many of the study participants. The goal of the study was to follow the subjects to autopsy, to wait until they died from syphilis or other causes, and then perform autopsies upon them to observe the effects of untreated syphilis upon the human body. So Jones notes a common misperception about the experiment. And it's a misperception that I have heard coming out of the mouth of an Ivy League educated neurologist. So it is a misperception that transcends educational levels, as it were. A widely held misperception, which is the idea that the government intentionally infected Black men with syphilis in the Tuskegee Study. So the Public Health Service didn't infect any of the study participants. That is not the case. They didn't infect the men in the study. They just diagnosed them and then waited for them to die. This, in terms of the ethical principles we have been discussing, is a blatant failure of the medical profession's duty to care. It is a failure of beneficence. So we can also read the key ethical failure here in terms of informed consent. So I'm going to read now from the text on pages 4 through 6. So if you have your text, get it out and follow along. Okay. So, since the effects of the disease are so serious, reporters in 1972 wondered why the men agreed to cooperate. The press quickly established that the subjects were mostly poor and illiterate, that the PHS, the Public Health Service, had offered them incentives to participate. The men received free physical examinations, free rides to and from the clinics, hot meals on examination days, free treatment for minor ailments, and a guarantee that burial stipends would be paid to their survivors. Though the latter sum, the burial stipends, was very modest, $50 in 1932, with periodic increases for inflation, it represents the only form of burial insurance that many of the men had. So it was the only life insurance that they had, the only way they could pay for a funeral. So these are potential inducements that they used to convince the men to agree to participate in the study. But what the health officials had told the men in 1932 was far more difficult to determine. An officer of the venereal disease branch of the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, the agency that was in charge of the Tuskegee Study in 1972, assured reporters that the participants were told at the beginning that they had syphilis and were told what the disease could do to them, and that they were given the opportunity to withdraw from the program at any time and receive treatment. So we should note there that what he is saying in his defense of the study is that the study was ethical, that it abided by the principles of research ethics. So these include, in his account, informed consent. So the participants were told at the beginning that they had syphilis. They were told what the disease could do to them. And importantly, this is a distinction that belongs to research ethics that we haven't studied much before, that they were given the opportunity to withdraw from the program at any time. So participants in a research study must have the opportunity to withdraw from the research. So you're not compelled to abide by your consent as a participant in a study. Okay, so, but is this true? Did the men in the study know that they had the disease and what it could do to them? Were they given the opportunity to withdraw? James Jones cites Dr. Williams next, who says quite definitively, the people who came in were not told what was being done. We told them we wanted to test them. They were told, they were not told, so far as I know, what they were being treated for or what they were not being treated for. At the end of the paragraph, he says, we didn't tell them we were looking for syphilis. I don't think they would have known what that was. A subject in the experiment said much the same thing. Charles Pollard recalled clearly the day in 1932 when some men came by and told him that he would receive a free physical examination if he appeared the next day at a nearby one-room school. So I went on over and they told me I had bad blood, Pollard recalled. And that's what they've been telling me ever since. They come around from time to time and check me over and say, Charlie, you've got bad blood. So this is where the title of the book comes from. This is the claim that the public health officials, the doctors and nurses who ran the study, this is what they told the participants. An official at the Centers for Disease Control stated that he understood the term bad blood was a synonym for syphilis in the Black community. Pollard replied, that could be true, but I never heard no such thing. All I knew was that they just kept saying I had the bad blood. They never mentioned syphilis to me, not even once. Moreover, he thought that he had been receiving treatment for bad blood from the first meeting on. For Pollard added, they've been doctoring me on and off ever since then, and they gave me a blood tonic. Okay. So we can read the key ethical failure here in terms of informed consent. In order to do this, we're going to have to go over the concept of informed consent, which you guys did a really good job of explaining on your exams. So on your midterms, you recognized that informed consent is not just about providing general information about a procedure, but it's about providing specific information that is relevant to the individual patient and making sure that they understand that information. So this we talked about in terms of the teach-back method, which you guys identified really clearly on your exams. And we talked about how the ideal informed consent conversation should be a two-way conversation in which the provider shares pertinent information with the patient and addresses the patient's concerns. In our readings, we have seen this referred to as part of patient-centered medicine. So the goal of informed consent is to protect patient autonomy. In the setting of research ethics, patients are consenting or not consenting to participation in a research study rather than a procedure. So the informed consent conversation, while very similar, communicates to the research subjects the specifics of the study, what the study will ask of them and why. So it requires that the participants understand that they are taking part in research. This is the first fundamental baseline, that the participants understand that they are taking part in research and that they understand the potential risks of that research so that they can make an autonomous decision free from coercion to participate in the study or not. So the participants in the Tuskegee study were not informed of their diagnosis. And furthermore, they were under the impression that they were receiving medical treatment, not that they were participating in a research study. Therefore, they were unable to consent to participation in a non-treatment study. So part of the reason that we have these rules today is because of the ethical failure of the Tuskegee Study. So the revelation of the Tuskegee Study in the 1970s helped shape the rules and expectations for informed consent in medical research and clinical practice today. So after the study came to light, its defenders were quick to point out that the treatments available for syphilis in the 1930s were often as dangerous as the disease itself. This is similar to what people think about chemotherapy for cancer today. And in fact, the standard treatments for syphilis in the 1930s were early forms of chemotherapy. But no one would set up a non-treatment study of cancer today just because the therapies we have aren't perfect. To do so would be to violate the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. So let me try to explain it a little bit, because I hear you guys objecting that we set up studies all the time in which people don't get treatment. That is true, but that's not the same thing as a non-treatment study. So it's not as if there's one group of patients that gets a new exciting cancer drug and one group that does not. Instead, we have two groups of patients, of research subjects. One that has cancer, say, and one that's just doesn't. That's the ordinary population. So there's one group with the disease and one group that is the controls that does not have that disease. And then you just watch them. So you don't tell them that you have the disease, nobody gets any treatment at all, and you check on them every year and see what's happening. See how their bodies are deteriorating. And you wait until they die, and then you do autopsies. That is what happened at the Tuskegee Syphilis study, and that's why a non-treatment study is on the very baseline unethical, because it fails in terms of the providers of medicine's general duty to care. So the Tuskegee study was founded on the assumption of not providing treatment, and it continued on that premise even after the highly effective treatment of penicillin became available in 1943. Neither the experiment nor its premises were a secret. Multiple articles about the study and its findings were published in well-respected, peer-reviewed American medical journals. It was run by the National Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control in coordination with state and local institutions, including the Alabama State Board of Health, the Macon County Board of Health, the Tuskegee Institute, the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital at the Tuskegee Institute, and the Tuskegee Medical Society. It had the endorsement of one of the most prestigious Black educational institutions in the Jim Crow South, the Tuskegee Institute, including the use of its hospital facilities and the cooperation of its medical staff, as well as the support of the local white medical community. So I'm just going to pause here for a sec and say that making the Tuskegee synonymous with the Tuskegee Syphilis study does a small disservice to the Tuskegee Institute, which is a hugely important historically Black university in Alabama, and it was a major institution, a major powerful educational force during the time of segregation, during the time referred to as Jim Crow, when African Americans were not permitted to study at the same educational institutions as white Americans. So the Tuskegee Institute is super important and super well respected, and lots of famous important people went there. But the thing that is curious to us, the thing that raises some really deep ethical questions, is the fact that in the 1930s, they signed off on this study. They signed off on this non-treatment study. So we're going to get to those questions as we go. But the first question that we're going to address is why Tuskegee? Why this town in Alabama? So Tuskegee is the name of the town and the university. And the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was preceded conceptually and logistically by a public health campaign funded by a nonprofit called the Rosenwald Fund, and it was a syphilis control demonstration. So it was a large study that happened before the Tuskegee syphilis study that was designed to observe the prevalence of disease and the feasibility of treatment, specifically for syphilis in the rural South. So the syphilis control demonstration took place in 6 counties. One of them was Macon County, where the town of Tuskegee is located. And it was both diagnostic, so it was a sort of public health effort to try to understand how many people had syphilis in these counties, and it involved treatment. So there was an effort made to treat the syphilitic populations and diagnose them at the same time. But it ended in the early years of the Great Depression due to lack of funds. So it's worth noting here also that the Tuskegee syphilis study begins in 1932, which is in the thick of the Great Depression in the United States. So there was this study that was taking place that had to shut down because it ran out of money. And the purpose of this study was to just figure out how many people in the rural South had syphilis. And they did it by setting up 6 different sites and doing a bunch of testing and a bunch of treatment in these 6 different sites. And the site that had the highest incidence of syphilis was the Tuskegee site, was Macon County. And the rate of syphilis infections amongst the population was extraordinarily high. It was 35%. Okay, that's more than 1 in 3 people had syphilis. So the Tuskegee study that followed that original study was actually kind of similar. So when it started out, it began as a data collection effort. So there was no money for treatment, but they figured they could keep counting. They could keep studying the prevalence of syphilis in the population. And the rate of infection in Macon County, according to the studies, the people who set up the study in the first place, quote, offered an unparalleled opportunity for the study of the effect of untreated syphilis. So they began this experiment by looking at that same group they had looked at before in the late 20s or around 1930. And it began as a year-length serological study of the same population as the syphilis control demonstration. So they did lumbar punctures of the same people that they had studied before, and the idea was that they were going to get more biological data to back up the statistical data that they had originally acquired. But in 1933, so the next year, the Tuskegee syphilis study was renewed with a new goal, which was stated: the continuance of the observation of the Negro men used in the study with the idea of eventually bringing them to autopsy. So with the aim of following these men until their death and performing autopsies, the Public Health Service began a long-term observation of the effects of their own interventionist practice of medical neglect. So another way of thinking about this is to say that Macon County was chosen as the site for the study because it contained a useful paradox of technological progress and primitive conditions. So this is a quote from James Jones, who we are reading for today, but from a different section than what you read. And he writes that Macon County contained thousands of infected Negroes who lived outside the world of modern medicine, yet close to a well-equipped teaching hospital that could easily double as a scientific laboratory. So not only was approximately 35% of the population of Macon County infected with syphilis, but they were conveniently located. How can one be outside the world of modern medicine and simultaneously live close to a well-equipped teaching hospital? The answer is that you can't. The study participants lived inside the world of modern medicine, but they were held outside of it by the socioeconomic conditions of the world they lived in, by poverty and racism, which limited their access to medical care. So Macon County was imagined as a nature preserve for syphilis. The PHS researchers consistently presented their work as a study in nature, while they were engaging in an interventionist experiment. The reading that we did for today details active measures that the researchers took to prevent the patients from obtaining treatment. But the very act of diagnosis was their primary intervention. The researchers diagnosed syphilis and then acted as if syphilis was the natural condition of the Negro male in Macon County, Alabama. The prevalence of syphilis in the demonstration population was presented as an organic accident of geography and time, rather than conditions influenced by institutionalized racism, widespread poverty, and socioeconomic inequality. Untreated syphilis was presented as the natural condition of the study subjects, while, in fact, it was the result of centuries of oppression. Which leads us to our next question. Why Black men in particular? There were plenty of poor, uneducated white men with syphilis in Alabama in 1932. But why did the researchers choose to focus on Black men? The answer has to do with stuff that we were talking about last week in terms of institutionalized racism and race functioning as a biological fact in medical discourse. So Jones references a couple times in his text a Norwegian study of untreated syphilis that occurred in 1891 and again in 1910. The Norwegian study was a study of patient records, so it was rather different in scope and in sort of ethical expectations than the non-treatment study that took place at Tuskegee. Yet it was a study of untreated syphilis on a white population. American doctors sought to replicate this study in the 1930s in Tuskegee because they understood Black American bodies to be fundamentally different from white Norwegian ones. The goal of the study was not just to observe the effects of untreated syphilis, but to observe the effects of untreated syphilis on Black men. A medical theory of racial difference was a key factor in the study from the start. So this is true as well from the public health perspective. The medical professionals who participated in this experiment understood themselves to be performing a study that would be of particular relevance to Black communities. In the 1930s, syphilis was seen as an epidemic disease that disproportionately affected Black populations in the rural South. And in fact, this was true. So the original syphilis control demonstrations, which demonstrated an infection rate of 35% in the largely Black population of Macon County, Alabama, were part of a progressive era project which aimed at attaining statistically relevant figures for the prevalence of syphilis amongst Southern populations and amongst American populations at large. So, like the larger public health movement, the initial control demonstrations aimed at acquiring scientifically accurate information about a medical problem, yet their efforts were directed by a set of inherited assumptions about the population with which they engaged. So the medical discourses around syphilis in the late 19th and early 20th century posited a high rate of infection in African Americans, supported by meager clinical evidence and plentiful moral judgment. Physical inferiority and sexual promiscuity were held to blame for the presence of syphilis amongst Black populations in the South and amongst immigrant populations in the North. So the rate of infection of syphilis in Black populations in the South was blamed on physical inferiority, that Black people are physically inferior to white people, and sexual promiscuity, that Black people and Black men in particular were seen as innately sexual, sexually promiscuous. And the rate of infection of syphilis was blamed on those social inventions, those social factors, rather than an alternate set of social factors, which were lack of education or lack of access to healthcare. So both Black populations in the South and immigrant populations in the North were early targets of public health campaigns to rid the American body of the syphilitic scourge. Both groups had relatively little access to education and also relatively little access to healthcare. The syphilitic Negro in particular was an exemplary embodiment of the moral depravity and mental deformity that early 20th century public health reformers sought to remove from the American body politic. So this is the set of inherited assumptions that doctors are working with when they decided, let's study syphilis in Black men. That will tell us some useful new information. So if this study is based on a set of deeply racist assumptions about innate biological difference, why did an institution of such prominence in the African American community as the Tuskegee Institute agree to support this study? Why did Black doctors and nurses like Nurse Rivers help run it? So the study was carried out by a racially mixed group of upwardly mobile, middle-class physicians and nurses upon a population of poor Black agricultural workers. So there were the white doctors who came for the annual roundups from Washington, from the Public Health Service, and then the people who ran the study on the ground all year long were primarily Black. There was Nurse Rivers, who did most of the logistical work for the study, and there were a couple of doctors who worked at the Andrew Hospital at the Tuskegee Institute, who did most of the autopsies for this study. So the study was carried out by this racially mixed group of upwardly mobile middle-class physicians and nurses upon a population of poor Black agricultural workers. The experiment constructed its subjects as non-modern folk. In practice, the study engaged a growing split between race and class in the New South. The Tuskegee Institute and the infamous study that it endorsed were equally engaged in training a Black middle class to manage a Black working class. The experiment was sold to the Tuskegee Institute by Washington, by the Public Health Service, as an invaluable educational opportunity for the nursing students at Andrew Hospital, and a project that would employ Black doctors and nurses during the Depression. And it did. So, the role of Nurse Rivers, a Black woman educated at Tuskegee, who ran the on-the-ground logistical aspects of the study for nearly its entire course, reflects the troubled interplay of race and class that allowed the Institute to endorse the study in the first place. Nurse Rivers served as the liaison between each new group of white male government doctors who came for the yearly roundups and the Black male subjects who were rounded up for yearly physical examinations. She provided the continuity necessary to keep the experiment running for as long as it did. The men in the study came to refer to themselves as members of, quote, a social club and burial society called Miss Rivers's Lodge. And remember back to one of the endorsements that they got was burial insurance. So that's what a burial society would provide. So Nurse Rivers was not an evil woman. She had meaningful, long-term relationships as a nurse and social worker with the men in the study, and their wives and children. She even married the son of one of the study subjects, one of the controls, one of the non-syphilitic men in the study. Yet her presence in their lives, in the lives of the men in the study, was founded on their continued unspoken exploitation as subjects of a non-treatment experiment. She had a personal economic interest, especially in the Depression years, in the continuation of the study. Yet she also lived in the community and had a professional interest as a nurse and social worker in improving the lives of its citizens. So if you open your text and look on page 168, you get a description of all of the really good things that Nurse Rivers did in her career in Macon County. She did really good things. But if you look on pages 162 through 163, you get a description of the great lengths that she went to ensure that the men in the study did not receive treatment, even when public health workers eventually brought treatment programs to Alabama. So how do we square this circle? How do we understand the two sides of Nurse Rivers? She did not view this as a contradiction. The Tuskegee Study, I would argue, went on for so long, not merely because of the rationalizations and career interests of the Public Health Service administrators who began the study and who made the official case for its continuation long past its due date, if it ever had one, But it went on so long because its active participants, Nurse Rivers, the junior PHS officers who were doing their field work, the black doctors at Andrew Hospital, the men in the study, their wives and children, all believed they were doing something good. The young, idealistic doctors who were sent on assignment to Tuskegee, who had sacrificed a lucrative career in private practice to join the public health service and fight venereal disease, did not think that they were actively harming or exploiting the men in the experiment. The doctors understood that they were administering a non-treatment study, that the men had syphilis and that they were not receiving treatment. Yet they also understood themselves to be providing medical care to poor black men in the rural South who had little to no access to care of any sort. And they did provide the men with health care. They really did. Just not for the disease that was killing them. This is what institutionalized racism looks like. So just like the doctors that you guys will encounter next week in the film No Mas Bebés, so those doctors are obstetricians at Los Angeles County General Hospital who were performing coerced sterilizations on Hispanic women in the 1970s. So just like those doctors, the doctors and nurses who ran the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male understood themselves to be acting with the best intentions for the people they were directly harming. The people being understood not as individuals, but as a group. So here's where justice comes in. Thinking back to our key terms in medical ethics, we have discussed thus far how the Tuskegee study was a failure of beneficence and the duty to care. So the researchers in the study first failed to treat the men for the disease that was killing them. This is a failure of beneficence. It was also a failure of non-maleficence in preventing the men from obtaining treatment, in diagnosing them and then observing them. The PHS was actively harming the study participants. So it was not a study in nature, but an active intervention, maintaining the men in an untreated state and pretending that it was natural. This is a failure of non-maleficence. We also discussed the failure to obtain informed consent, which violates the ethical principle of autonomy. Finally, we have come to the question of justice. The men were denied equal access to medical treatment in the name of the study. This, first, is a simple failure of distributive justice, which says that medical care should be distributed in a rational, just, and fair manner. Yet, in another sense, in a bigger picture sense, the conditions which created the study, the things that made it seem like a good idea to do this study, those conditions reflect the systemic effects of social injustice, which we discussed last week. One of the key features of biomedical ethics, as we have studied it in this course, is an emphasis on the individual. We have seen some situations in which the emphasis upon the individual in our culture is potentially difficult or dangerous. When we watched Lulu Wang's film and we talked about how autonomy might look different in different cultures, or when the week that we did quarantine and we talked about the difficulty in a situation of quarantine, of balancing the respect for individual autonomy and the concern for the public, for public health. And here is a very similar example. This is, after all, a public health study. But it is an example of a situation in which a failure to consider the rights of the individual led to an extraordinary social injustice. So the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male failed to consider its participants as individual patients with rights, and instead considered them as representatives of a larger social group, the group of the Negro male. It considered itself to be addressing what was called at the time the Negro problem, which was essentially the problem of systemic racism, known by another name. So the Tuskegee Study did something that is a feature of all modern medical research, in that it viewed its subjects as representative of the larger population. Yet thinking to what principles we can learn from this and understanding research ethics, we can see that research ethics functions as a check on this generalizing impulse in medical research. So the goal of research ethics is to ensure that each study, which functions on the premise of viewing its subjects as representative, nonetheless treats its participants as individuals, as individual patients. So part of the legacy of the Tuskegee Study is to ensure that this emphasis on the individual is preserved publicly and legally in medical research. At least we hope. So that's it for today, guys. If you have any questions about this, I know that some of you guys had questions about the distinction between social justice and distributive justice that we talked about last week, and I hope some of this conversation clarifies it. But if you have more questions for me about the concepts in this week's text, or about the readings and about the materials from last week and this week, please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I will look forward to receiving your worksheets and giving you feedback. Okay, take care.